5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Who's got the family, friendship, travel?
All right.
I got my own sort of initials.
So please
Please
total your signatures. Please total your signatures.
Like every individual one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And we said a minimum we should have is
Do you want a total in the
12.
circle here?
Nope. Just make a mental note. You can write it down on your paper, circle it somewhere on your paper, and we'll come back to that. So, was there anyone that was at least able to get 5 signatures? All right.
Yeah.
Anyone able to get at least 10 signatures?
Yes.
All right. Do people get more than 10? All right.
14.
You get 14 signatures?
17.
17?
Dude.
1, 2,
All right.
6, 7, 8, 9.
Anyone more than 17? All right. So you guys are the winners. Let's give them a hand for 17 signatures. Woo! Overachievers.
I just might have got past everybody a little bit more.
Okay.
Someone signed their name on everything of mine, so that's
Okay.
I racked up points.
You racked up points for that. All right. Cool. So as you were going around and you're looking at other people's papers, were there things that you thought about that you saw in other people's papers and you were like, man, why didn't I think of that? I should have wrote this thing down or that thing down. What were some of those things that you saw in other people's papers and you were like, wow, I value that too. I should have wrote that down. Security. All right. Love. What were you saying?
No, I was just listening.
Okay.
Independence.
What's that?
Independence.
Knowledge. Right. Travel. As you look at your own paper, were there some things that got fewer signatures, or maybe didn't get any signature on your paper? What were those things? That
Love.
health. All right. So please raise your hand if you value health. Like even if it wasn't written on your paper, but you still value health.
Where
Raise
was your
hand.
signatures?
All right. All right. So someone else. What was something that had few signatures or no signatures?
Quiet time.
Sorry.
So quiet time?
Yeah.
Please raise your hand if you value quiet time, even if you don't get it. Right? You value it. You said employment?
Yeah.
Yeah. Please raise your hand if you value employment, having a job, at your job.
Otherwise, you're gone.
Right. Like, what's the purpose of being here? Right. So cool.
Could you leave the room and then we can take another?
Yeah. So you all are smart. All right. So what do you think is the point of this particular activity? Like, what was I after by having us start with this activity?
See how much we have in common?
To see how much we have in common.
See, how people value different things.
Yes.
And how people,
others.
and how people value different things than others.
And how you value different things yourself.
And then
what's important to you?
So what's important to you? How do you value certain things yourself, right? Yeah. So one thing I'd like to offer, it's obvious that people have been in diversity trainings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cultural competence trainings. And it sounds like you went through some kind of, okay, cool. No, then
This is the first one.
well, good. So this means you can be the most helpful because the rest of them I have to fix.
You didn't even do that at the sheriff's
Right.
office?
Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, we did do that.
Okay. So oftentimes what has happened, particularly around issues of cultural competence, is trainers or curriculum has focused on one aspect of our differences or commonalities or the other. It's focused on one, how we're different or how we're similar. And what I would like to suggest is that both are true simultaneously. That diversity is the accounting and recognition of our commonalities and our differences, right?
It's a dialectic.
It is in fact
Nice. Throw that out there.
Yep. So it is, and they're relational. right? So our commonalities and our differences. So, yeah, so I'll go along with that a little bit more later. So, one of the things that we also have to recognize is that context is extremely important. And you'll hear me repeatedly say this throughout the day, that context is everything. Context is everything. One of the shortfalls or the failings that I oftentimes see with cultural competence training is that they give me tips on how to keep eye contact or not keep eye contact with people, when to bow to people or to shake a hand or not shake a hand. So they give me all these tips and how-tos, but I never get a sense of the context by which those things are to be done or not done, right? So context is extremely important. So we'll talk more about context than we will about the specifics of how to or when not to, because the context is more important. People say that culture eats strategy for lunch. That's what folks say in kind of the business world around this kind of training, that culture eats strategy. But I will tell you that context trumps culture, right? So as context changes, so does culture, and we'll talk more about that. And you'll see that as I look around at the things you've written on these walls already. I see a lot of the fact that context is trumping even individuals' choices and how they see the world. So we'll talk about that. So in the United States, in Western nations, we have a particular kind of context, and we have to recognize the context that we're in, so then we understand the behavior. Because if we don't take into the context, we'll never really understand the behavior, and the behavior will seem strange, right? So in the United States, we have a particular kind of context, and one of the driving forces of that context is the Constitution of the United States. So if you attend a training and at no point they don't talk about the Constitution of the United States, the training and the trainer should be suspect. Should be suspect. Because the reason and the teeth that we have in doing this work in the United States stems from the Constitution, right? So let's go to it. So the preamble to the Constitution, right on page 1. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So those who come behind us, right? We do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, right? Declaration of Independence, paragraph 2. We've heard this a number of times. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Great words, yes? Great picture. I mean, if you think about when I read those, I get a warm fuzzy in my heart, right? I get excited about what the promise of this great nation is. Simultaneously, as these words, as this picture is being created, what is simultaneously also happening?
And slavery and the 3/5 rule.
So the transatlantic slave trade is happening simultaneously, right? What else is happening simultaneously?
Women can't vote.
Women aren't participating in this government. What else is happening?
Minorities aren't participating in the government either.
So minorities aren't participating in the government either. And specifically, who are these so-called minorities?
The black population, yellow population.
So black people aren't participating. Asians aren't participating. Hispanics aren't participating, which is interesting, and we'll come back to that terminology too, right? So in the 70s, there was this place called Olin Mills Studio. And Olin Mills was at a time when you would take a picture and then you'd have to send it off to get it developed. I know this sounds crazy, doesn't it? You have to send the picture off to get developed, and then they would send you back the picture. So you had to wait and all this stuff, right? So in my family, we would take holiday photos at every opportunity that we could, and we would have to make an appointment to go get our picture. I know, it's crazy, isn't it? We'd have to make an appointment to go get our picture taken with this photographer in the studio. Now, Olin Mills had like this oatmeal kind of background in all of their photos. So if you ever look at old photos, you'll see that. It's like, why, right? And so they had this thing, and then towards the end of the life of this photography style or whatever, they tried to jazz it up, right? So what they would do is they would take a picture of the family looking forward at the camera, and then they would take one where they're slightly looking off into the sunset, right? It's just like the weirdest, trippiest thing. Like, you know, are they on acid? Like, what is going on, right? So they would do that. Now, because we had to wait, it was a big deal to go take these pictures. So we would show up as a family, we'd take the picture, and then we'd have to wait. So when the photos came back, for me, now I'm not egocentric or anything like that, but I do have a decent sized ego, right? I mean, I have a healthy ego, right? So with my healthy ego, when those pictures came back, who did I look for in those pictures?
Yourself.
I looked for myself. Like, what did I look like? You know, and I'm judging myself, you know, and I'm like, oh man, I should have smiled better. You know, why'd they pick this one? They took 5 shots. Why'd they pick this one and not the other? You know, right? And so I'm judging all this stuff and I'm looking at it. And this would happen year after year. But I wonder what would happen if year 1, I'm at the studio with my family, the photos come back, and I'm not in the picture. Like, I'm fuzzy, right? What might you think about that? So year 1, this happens. What would be your first inclination? What would you say?
That wasn't fair.
You would say that's not fair. What's not fair?
Not being included in the family.
So I'm not included in the family, you know, but I'm there. I'm just a little bit fuzzy, right? What? Yeah, go ahead.
It'd be confusing and like, what's going on? Why wasn't I included?
Yeah. So it might be confusing, and why wasn't I included?
I said ghosts.
You would say
It's on my
ghost.
mind today.
Okay, cool, creepy house, ghost, right? Who would you blame? Where would blame go?
The photographer.
The photographer. It's the photographer's fault, right? And you would say, you know, you might even say, Mom, Dad, we need to get our money back because I'm not in the photo. You guys knew I was there, right? But I'm not in the photo. And so we would say that it's the photographer's fault. But let's say this happens for 5 years. 5 years of these photos, you go, you're with your family, and you don't show up in any of the photos. Then where does blame start to drift?
Ooh.
Family, why are you going to this photographer?
So first you go to the family and say, why do you keep going to this photographer? What?
You might be jumping around when he's taking the photos.
Okay, so you might be jumping around, so you might start blaming yourself. So there's something about me. So then people start saying, well, let me take your photo. And then you start saying what to the people?
I'm not a good.
I'm not good at taking photos. Don't take my photo. I'm not, right? The thing I think is really interesting when we look at the Constitution of the United States and we look at this preamble is that it created a very beautiful picture, but everybody wasn't included in that picture. And so who's missing from this picture? Who's missing from this beautiful picture? All men are created equal. We know that in context at the time, they said men, but they meant humanity in that particular context. But how has that played out? Right? We also, it was interesting, I heard conversations about white privilege, and we'll talk about that because I have a problem with that whole nomenclature, and you'll understand why once we get to it. But the so-called men who were participating in this, let's back up. The transatlantic slave trade was happening, right? And the United States played its part in it. It was a global economic system. The United States played its part in it. Were the majority of white people who who could afford to own slaves, was that the majority of white people, or was that a minority of white people who were able to afford to own slaves?
Minority.
It was a minority, right? So it was a minority group of white people who were able to own slaves. In context, when we talk about people who were able to participate in the government, who were the folks that were able to vote? Who were the folks that were able to engage in the government?
Landowners.
White?
The minority apparently.
The minorities, right? So the white
Slave owning.
slave-owning, land-owning individuals who were, in fact, the minority of white people, right? So even when we talk about the early constitutional days, we're not talking about a picture that was designed for everyone. However, one of the things, some of my brothers and sisters say to me, well, Andre, why do you do what you, if this country wasn't designed for you, why do you participate in it and that kind of stuff? And I laugh and I said, because they wrote the words down. They wrote them down, and because I'm a member, they apply to me too. And they never should allow me to read. Right? And so when we think about this, when we talk about social justice, and this is one of those things that is crucial for those of us who believe in social justice, the equality of the individual to have participation in a system that is supposed to be designed to serve them. What's important for us to recognize is that social justice isn't some left soft thing, but it is a part of American society. All of this stuff was written down because this is not what we were getting from England. We weren't getting these things from England. There was no social justice in our relationship with England. So we said, no, this is the kind of country we want to have. So when people talk about social justice, don't let them make it seem like it's a soft thing, because it's not. What it is making sure that people have access to everything that is written in that Constitution. And as context changes, so must amendments be made to that great sacred document, right? So it is not perfect because we are not perfect. It is not infallible because we are fallible, right? And as context changes, amendments need to and have been made to make sure that this is the promise that everyone can meet, right? So let's go back to those gray circles, right? Was there, as you look at those 5 things that you wrote down, is there anything there that could specifically address, or if you just looked at that value, you could tell someone's racial or ethnic group? Is there, of those 5 things that you wrote down, is there something that signifies your ethnic or racial group based on those 5 things?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not that you're aware of? Okay.
Same.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So most of you are saying no. All right, cool. Out of those 5 things, is there any one particular thing that I could look at that and say, oh, I know what their gender is, or their gender expression based on those things? So for you, that's true.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Anyone else?
Maybe you could infer it, but I doubt it.
Maybe you could infer it, but you doubt it. All right, cool. Is there anything, as you look at those 5 things, that would denote your IRS tax bracket, right? Your socioeconomic group? Is there any one thing there that would denote what tax bracket you might fall in?
One thing maybe.
Maybe, okay? One thing maybe, right? So most of us, we said, looking at those 5 things, you couldn't tell, or you wouldn't be privy to my race or my ethnicity, my gender or gender identity or gender expression, or my socioeconomic status. For most of us, we said that those things cannot be found out about those, right? Why is that? Like, why didn't people put down their race, or why didn't people put down their gender or their socioeconomic status? Why didn't you?
It doesn't necessarily have to be what gender you are. I mean, I put down, like my wife. Well, I mean, if I was, gay, I guess I would put down my husband.
You could.
So then,
You could.
yeah.
Why else? Why didn't people put down their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their tax?
For me, it was bigger than that.
Say more.
Like, so one of mine was happiness. There's a lot that goes into that, so it's not just one thing that kind of makes that up
Okay.
for me. Nor does let's just say tax bracket. Nor does that define like everything in my life.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Along with that, it's kind of what you're talking about earlier, where like we have some things in common, and then some of us like have nothing in common, and then it's all individual at the same time. Whereas like I was thinking about these, and right, like so much of like who I am, what's salient to me, actually goes into this. Right, like my ability to have these things is dictated by some of the things that you were talking about. Right, like access to healthcare. Right, like I'm intersectionality. Right, like I'm middle class woman, educated. Right, like I have a better access to healthcare than some people in this country.
Okay.
So while it wasn't there, it was kind of omnipresent.
Okay.
Like I agree. Like there's maybe building blocks. Like one of mine is enjoyment, but like there's
A cultural context.
there could be. Or when I mentioned one of mine could be construed towards socioeconomic status, I put home in parentheses safe space, and so it jumped off the page to me. It's like not everybody's home is their safe space. Like I had a kid in my office yesterday telling me he misses being in jail. It's preferable to where he lives now. So that because I can provide my home as my safe space, that directly ties into like my earning.
Yeah. Yeah. So go ahead.
And even sitting here though, we're kind of a homogenous group, right? And our values may look very different than, let's say, our clients' values.
But what if that wasn't true?
What do you mean? Like, what if it didn't look different? Or,
Yeah. Or what if they aren't different?
Like if you did this in group therapy later today and we had the same results.
Yes, and one of the ones that I think of is like power would be one that I think would be especially at Alpha. That would be one that would be present a lot. Or
You put freedom, I put independence. That's
The same.
fancy names for power.
or security, but it would just look different across cultures.
So you put your
Oh,
pen
but
up.
it's
So
good though, I bet. But I wonder if it's the same, like, I think we're all, I should say we all, for those who do, enjoy, you guys have really good ones,
no judgment. Don't judge.
Friends.
Yeah.
I think people who feel unsafe or inadequate are very hesitant about who's in their friend circle, but they may actually want
it.
So I think so anyway, it's just very interesting to see that. For me, when I have this kind of cryptic thinking, some of it I can't control. So I'm black, but I can't change it. I mean, it wasn't an application that I filled out that said, hey, make me overweight and black and blah, blah, blah. So I kind of had
And good looking.
Yeah. So,
Bring them down to earth.
but these 5 circles, I have a role in it. I mean, I can either control it or make an effort to get it. Same thing. Now my economic status that I have a role in, but ethnicity and what else did you say?
So we did. Yeah.
Orientation and gender and all that. I mean, that's. So I think these things I have control over, or role, or play a role. And those things I can't, or I have them already. And then these either not enhance, But these either play a role with who I am.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
So the real point of this exercise, and I would encourage you if you can or choose to do this in therapy or any circles, is to really look at the fact that the so-called differences that we have are actually obstacle illusions. Optical illusions, artificial barriers to authentic human relationships, right? As opposed to, optical illusions where we see it with our eyes, but these are actually barriers. So who defines racial categories in the United States? Where does that definition come from? So this is one of the things where people get stuff confused, and I say context is important. Context is everything. Right? So how many people have heard people say that race is a social construct? Right? Sorta. It's a little bit short-sighted. Because have you ever filled out a questionnaire determining that asks your opinion, because you're a member of a society, of what racial categories we should have? Have you ever been sent a survey? Right? No, I haven't gotten a survey. Nobody ever asked me. So if racial identities are created by societies, you would think there'd be some kind of survey or something, right? That the society would fill out. But there isn't. And so when we talk about this idea of race, we talk about these obstacle illusions. Race is determined. It is actually not a social construct. It is a governmental organizing tool. So anytime you fill out an application or whatever, it is driven by the Constitution of the United States that says we have to have a census every 10 years. And so how we define race is determined by that census. And then the EEO, which is also the Equal Employment Commission, has its determination of racial categories. Now, here's the interesting thing. A Ford F-150, people familiar with that?
Yeah.
It's a truck, for those who don't know, right? If I place that truck anywhere on the planet outside of the United States, what is that truck?
Ford F-150.
It's a Ford F-150, no matter where it is on the planet. However, racial categories are not the same. It doesn't apply. If race was a real thing, no matter where you go on the planet, it should be the same, right? But the racial categories we have in the United States are very different than the ones they have in Canada. The ones they have in Canada are very different than the ones they have in Mexico. The ones they have in Mexico are very different than the ones in Brazil. Why? Context is everything, right? So even if we talk about gender roles and gender expressions, in the United States, it's very different than it is in North Africa. In North Africa, it's very different than it is in Australia, right? Context is everything. And so one of the things, and even the young person who said, I'm safer in jail than I am in my own home, is because of the context, right? So in the context of a confined space where the rules are clear, there's regiment, there's order, that's the context. It is not that they necessarily care for the culture, but they respond to the culture because the context is a rigid, logical, systemic way. And so oftentimes we get confused because we think that people are responding to I wouldn't go this far to necessarily say this as a truism, but I would say that culture would be nothing without the context. That context actually drives the culture, and that the culture is a response to the context, right? So let's go over to page 2. And so one of the things we know is that we oftentimes are dealing with young people who have experienced trauma. Now, that trauma can come in a number of different kinds of ways. It could be domestic disturbance in a home, right? Either domestic violence of some sort, or alcohol abuse, or mental illness within a home. We know that it can be physical or emotional abuse. It could be, and that includes sexual abuse and the responses to that. So we have to have trauma-informed responses. I would say with the level of violence that is in our community, we are probably all dealing with trauma in one way, shape, form, fashion, or another, right? I don't know if anyone's ever played Fortnite. So it's a game that young people. So if you're not familiar with it, please become familiar with it. I'm not saying you have to play the game. You can go on YouTube, watch some of it, so that when you interact with your young people, you know what they're talking about and what they're into. I don't listen to all the music, but I listen to enough to recognize some themes in music and that kind of stuff, just as so that I can relate to the young people that I'm. So I do my own homework, right? But the level of violence that our young people are exposed to and sexuality that they're exposed to on a regular basis is causing trauma. Right, so I think trauma-informed care is not just for kids who have trauma that is very pronounced, but even micro trauma. I would love to see someone do a study on micro trauma, right? These small little things that young people are experiencing. So there's some ways to have some trauma-informed responses. You can read that on your own, and I'm sure you've had some training around that, and if not, this is a great introduction to that. The thing that I want to point to is this idea of these 4 truths about human beings and growth and development. First, human beings can learn, change, and grow, right? If we don't believe that, we're in the wrong field. Right? So for each of us, I'm sure there's a pattern, some kind of pattern of behavior that we had as a teenager that the adults that were around us hoped that we would change. And at some point and at some time, we did change that set of behaviors. I used to drag my feet. I used to drag my feet when I walked and kind of scuffle along. And lo and behold, after my parents, put me on punishment, they took things away, they did all their disciplinary actions. When I started buying my own shoes and my own pants, I stopped doing that, right? So one of the things to remember is that seeing change is not the same as recognizing that change is happening, right? One of the things that frustrated me the most as a teacher was expecting my students to change on my timeline, right? Expecting them to change on my timeline. And the only person that frustrated was me, right? I was frustrated. They were carrying on doing whatever they were doing until they found a need for change. But I'm the one that's frustrated. And so once we understand that our processes work, which is really why I encourage you to lean on research-based therapy methods, best practices, practical application, research therapy, because then you don't have to wonder if it's working. You can just work it, right? You can just work it. So all human behaviors, so human beings can learn, change, and grow. So if I put a seed in the ground, I don't have to, all things considered, I water it, I give it sunlight. When will the seed come up?
In the spring.
When it's ready.
When it's ready, right? It comes up when it's going to come up. All things considered, right? Within a certain amount of seasons and that kind of stuff, right? So all things considered, the right ground. I know it's going to come up. I just don't know when it's going to come up, right? And if it doesn't come up, then that means that I need to plant it. I need to change something so that it can grow, right? Second is that people do what they think works, even when what?
When it doesn't.
Even when it doesn't work, right? So they do what they think works, even when it doesn't. When it's not beneficial, when it even could be harmful to themselves. But here's the core question: why might they use a behavior that isn't reaping any benefits? Why would they do that?
They've gotten reinforced for it before.
Because it's worked before, right? And in our brain, and particularly with young people, here's something that I recognize about young people very early on. And again, you guys might probably recognize this long before I did. What do baby elephants have to know?
Baby elephants?
Baby elephants. What do they have to know?
To eat, survive.
They have to know how to eat. They have to know how to survive. All right. What do they have to know about the big elephants?
Don't get
Oh,
stuck.
don't get.
Don't get stepped on.
Get out the way.
Get out the way. Yeah. Baby elephants have to know everything about the big elephants. Everything. Right? Which ones are the nice ones? Which ones are the mean ones? Which ones have attitudes? Who I can get food from? Who will be?
Who's mom?
Who's mom? They have to know all of those things. What do big elephants have to know about baby elephants?
Don't step on them.
Do they have to know that?
No.
No, they don't. As a matter of fact, they don't even pay attention to the baby elephants unless it's their own, right? So they don't have to know anything, but the baby elephants have to know everything. So our young people, it is so funny because people will say goofy things about young people, and I remember being young. If I wanted to be successful in both in my community and in my household, I had to be in some ways smarter than the people that I'm responding to, right? I had to anticipate attitudes. I had to anticipate behaviors. I had to see things strategically before they went on. So it's very interesting. People will talk about teen dropouts. Anyone ever heard people? And what are some of the things that people say about teens who drop out?
Lazy.
That they're lazy. What else do they say?
Dumb.
That they're dumb. What else? They're not going to make it.
Up to no good.
That they're up to no good, right? Now, here's the interesting thing about dropouts. Michael Kors. Anyone familiar with Michael Kors, right? So if Michael Kors made a lamp and sold it at Target, right? And it was the ugliest thing people had ever seen. And it wasn't selling. What would Target do?
Put it on sale.
They discount it, right? They put it on sale. Now Michael Kors is a renowned designer, right? But Target would put it on sale. And if it didn't sell, what would they keep doing? They keep marking it down until they were gone. So they change it. Now, Michael Kors comes back to them and says, "We want to do another lamp for you, Target." What does Target say?
No.
Nah, we pass.
Or else we
Right.
want discount money on the other one.
Right? Yeah. Right. So they would do that. But when young people decide, when they see that a system isn't working for them, and they check out, who do we blame?
Them.
At any point, would Target blame the customers for not buying that ugly lamp? No. They would say, we just have to do it differently. So one of the things that we have to recognize is that when young people drop out of a system, what they're actually saying is, I'm not buying it because I can see that it doesn't work for me, right? So they're not lazy. They are intelligent. They see things for what they are, and they recognize that in my current state, I can't compete in that system, so I'm going to eject myself into another system where I can be more effective, right? And effective in what? And we'll talk about that in just a second. All human behavior is goal-directed. I do not believe that people don't know why they do things. They may not have a language. They may not have the awareness of how to say why they do things, but they do have a rationale for their human behavior. And one of the things that as professionals, we have to recognize, and again, I hope I'm not just preaching to the choir or reiterating things that you got back in Psych 101, but be able to articulate for them and anticipate for them what it is that they want. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And then lastly, attitude is a reaction to goals. Oftentimes we think that attitude, and not us in this room, but particularly as adults, that we get confused and actually think that attitude is a thing. And I would suggest that attitude is a side effect of something greater that we need to be paying attention to, right? So what have you been taught about an attitude? What is an attitude?
It's a problem.
It's a problem, all right?
It's not a good thing.
It's not good. Attitudes are not good.
It's maybe a mood that translates into behavior.
Okay, it's a mood that translates into
Just a
behavior.
reaction, maybe.
It's a reaction.
it determines your success or future.
It determines your success or your future. All right, cool. Really good answers. And those answers would have been inadequate for my parents. My parents went to a place called Old School. I don't know if anybody's, right? And one day my parents said that, and I said, well, where's your diploma from Old School? Like, what's the address to Old School, right? So I've always been kind of quick-witted. And sometimes it's worked out for me and other times not. But this idea of attitude. And so I am and always have been kind of a late bloomer. And so my parents would say very interesting things to me. Like, if they didn't like my attitude, my dad would say things like, boy, you better fix your face. And so I would fix my face, and he didn't appreciate that, so he'd say, go to your room, right? Or my mother would, she just cut straight to it. She'd say, boy, I don't like your attitude. You better go to your room and get your act together. So I go to my room, I get my act together, I step out into the hallway, and I'd say, to be or not to be. I spent a lot of time in my room, just so you know, right? Because that's not what they were talking about attitude. So my dad was my pastor growing up, and on Sundays we would go to church from 7:30 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. We stop at 3 o'clock for chicken, not because we're black, but because chicken is delicious. Right? So all day church on Sunday. Friday night, my dad loves me. I asked my dad for the car. What does he say?
Have it home by 11.
He says, have it home by 11. My dad loves me, right? Does he give me the car or not?
No.
Oh, he gives me the car. He loves me, right? My dad loves me. So I get the keys. I pick up my friends. We go cruising for girls. I don't know what would have happened had we found girls, but we're doing this cruising. I fill the car up with gas. I come home before curfew. I hand my dad the keys, and my dad says I have what kind of an attitude? I'm home before curfew. Car's full of gas.
Good attitude.
What's that?
Good at it.
I have a good attitude, right? So my dad says I have a good attitude. Sunday, my best friend Dexter calls me at noon and says, Andre, can you pick me up for the movies? What do I know about Sunday?
All day church.
Church all day, right? But I'm 17. I'm invincible. And Jesus is my friend. So I go to my dad and I say, Dad, can I borrow the car? And what does my dad say?
No.
Not only does he say no, but he gives me the sermon, right? And in my household, the worst consequence you could get was going to hell. And either you could go to hell on your own, or he would show you the way, right? So as a response to that interaction, what would my dad say about my attitude?
That's bad.
That I have a bad attitude, right? So wait a minute. Friday night, we're cool. I have a good attitude. My dad has a good attitude. Sunday, we got a problem. What's the problem? Church is not the problem. Right?
Expectations.
The expectations,
The goal.
the goal. When people get access or they get their goal, what kind of attitude do they have?
Good one.
They have a good attitude. When they're denied access or delayed access to their goal, what kind of attitude follows? A poor or a bad attitude. So you're seeing a client and they come in and they have a bad attitude. What do you already know? Before they open their mouths, before they present you with their problem or their perspective, what do you already know, or what should you already recognize about them as they come and sit before you?
It's going to be a bad day in Black Rock.
So it could be a bad day in Black Rock,
Their needs aren't being met.
that there's something that they're not getting. So as helpers, whether you're transporting them, whether you're doing an intake with them, how can you help them? Because there's two ways you can help them. What's the first way you can help them?
Validate.
So you can validate, and that makes me feel so much better.
Maybe. A little bit. At least
Does
we
that
have a
change an
connection.
attitude? Not necessarily.
No.
So what would change their attitude? What is it? What's the pinnacle? What's the piece that the pivot point is what I was looking for? What's the pivot point around that attitude?
I try and do like a positive interaction with them.
So you may want to have a positive interaction with them.
Figure out how to help them meet that need.
Help them meet the need, right? So I have a kid and they want. So this is a funny thing. So like I said, I taught school, and so my high schoolers, some of them were a little hard around the edges, right? And so I used to get into. Anyone ever heard of this idea of a power struggle? Ever, right?
No way.
So here's the interesting thing about power struggles. Power struggles only occur when the person with power forgets that they have power.
Yeah.
When they forget they have the power, that's when a power struggle ensues. So in my early days, I would, Jeffrey, get your feet off the table, or else, right? That kind of language, right? Demerits, and I stopped doing detentions because I was actually punishing myself to have to stay after school. And I stopped doing right. So I did other kind of positive interventions. But at any rate, so the thing to recognize about an attitude is if we can help them get what they want, and even if it's not how they want it. So an example, a student is feet up on the desk and that kind of stuff. In the old days, I would fight about him, fight about the tables on the desk and the rules, and this is not how we do things, and blah blah blah. And then the kids would cuss at me, and I'd say, "You can't say that," which is the goofiest thing to say because what? They already said it, right? So they can, right? So evolving through that process, what I did was I started including the so-called problem student and the solution in my classroom, right? I would make them my assistant. I give them everything that they're looking for. And so what was it that those students are looking for? What is it that these attitudes are responding to or trying to reach? Is the next bullet. That all human behavior is goal directed, and the goals are simply safety, significance, and belonging, right? And so as people, or as you interact, even with people outside of your professional environment, if you can recognize what are they after, right? Why do kids join gangs? Because they think, larceny is cool and fun? No, they are trying to get safety, significance, and belonging. Why would a kid rather go into lockup than be in a home? Because somewhere in lockup, they're able to get safety, significance, and belonging where they're not able to get that in their home, right? And so if I can give someone what they're looking for, right? Now, here's where the stuff gets really weird and sticky, right? So our bigoted, racist family members, what are they after with their racism, their bigotry, as we see it, right, as we may call it? What are they after?
Same thing.
Same thing as what?
You three.
Say it.
Safety, belonging, significance.
Safety, significance, and belonging, right? Now, I'll let you in on a little secret, and white people get nervous when I talk about this. So, apparently, so right around the holiday times, particularly in the winter, anybody get fruits and nuts? Do fruits and nuts like magically appear in your household around that time? They do in my household, right? So there's one particular nut that I find very interesting. Well, first two. One is walnuts, because my granddaddy used to take those and just crack them with his hands, like I'm like, yes, like this so cool. Now I'm like, whatever. So he would do that. But then there was this other nut that was like almost uncrackable, like it was impenetrable, and we refer to it as a Brazil nut. And so it's about an inch long or an inch and a half long. It's like an orange wedge, and it's mahogany on the outside. And usually you have to use a nutcracker to kind of to work it open. And but I found out that there are other people who call it by another name. They don't call it Brazil nuts. They call it, if you don't mind, nigger toes. They call it nigger toes. Now, I think that's interesting because I'm like, my family never called them that. Like, so I find that interesting. And then secondly, I know I've seen black people's toes and they don't look like that. Like, so how did they come to that? But that's beside the point. The thing I find most interesting is the people who used to call it that. Did they start that? Did they make that up? And in most cases, people would say that they didn't. But their context allowed them to use that kind of language, right? And so if people wanted to call those same things today, and it's so really interesting, it's actually not a nut, it's a seed. I didn't know that. So it's a part of a whole thing, and they just pull out these things. So it's not really a nut, it's a seed. But if people were to call it that today, what would we say?
Don't say that.
Yeah, we say, don't say that. That's not what we call it today. And we wouldn't tell them, it's African American nuts. Like, we wouldn't say that. We wouldn't say that. We would just say we don't. Why? Because the context has changed. And so what we have to recognize is that people are trying to get safety, significance, and belonging, but how they get it is largely depending upon the context that they're in. And so as context changes, so do people's adaptive behaviors. And so when you have a group of people who have adapted to a particular context, what do we call a group of people's adaptation to the context? Culture.
Culture. Okay.
We call it culture, right? Hip hop culture is what? People's adaptation to the context that they're in, right? Punk rock, technology, whatever. It's adaptation to the context. And what is that adaptation trying to get people to have or secure? Safety, significance, and belonging in their context, right? So, so there's that. It's 11 o'clock. Let's do another 5-minute break. What time are you guys going to do lunch?
What time do we want to do lunch?
We could throw it out on a table. We're gonna take a break.
You guys tell me where you're like hunger.
Yeah, you just
I'm good with eating anytime.
Okay.
okay.
Let's get stuff out.
Okay.
How about that?
Cool. So
Do you want to wait?
No, I can do it right now. Well, I mean, it gets here when it gets here, but if everyone's hungry, you guys can start.
Wait, you too. Okay, actually, I have my own personal.
Okay.
Whatever we want to do.
So if we can just take
I can adapt.
take a 5-minute break to. Did you want to set up lunch
I
now
don't know.
or?
What did you guys? I'm like the only one talking.
What are we
You gotta
deciding?
order.
We could wait for Tracy's.
Oh, no,
Okay.
wait on.
Are we
Yeah.
good with just being at noon since that's when we normally
Yeah.
eat?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then we can, because I think we'll only need like 15 minutes because all of the food is here.
Okay, cool.
We did a
So
potluck.
let's. But I do feel like we need to take a break.
No, that's
Yeah.
fine.
So if we can take it like a 5-minute break, 6-minute break,
Yep.
and then we'll
And
come
then
back.
maybe at noon we can just take like a 10-minute break and then we can
Definitely.
eat while we finish up the
Yep.
rest of the afternoon.
Yep. Wonderful.
And
Where's the bathroom in this joint?
Out the
Across
door
from
to the
elevators.
left, on the left side,
Oh.
next to the drinking fountain.
I'm ordering from that Rose Garden place you guys get from.
Yeah.
Is there? I have not eaten there before. I was just gonna get like noodles or lo mein of some sort, or is there like something they have that's like super good that I should?
It's all good.
Yeah, I've never had something from there I've been like.
All right. I was just gonna go straight noodles. I'd be down for some sesame chicken.
Have you guys ever had the orange chicken from Trader Joe's?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yes.
My wife
I
gets that all.
I just had it for the first time.
Heidi has some good orange chicken too. In the freezer.
Does Rose Garden have like decent like proportion?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
You're getting your money's worth.
All right. I just want to make sure I order the right amount. All right.
If I order for myself, it's 2 meals.
Okay. Okay.
Wow.
Update my schedule. Beauty for age. Go, go, go.
So how are you, sir? Good to
Oh,
see
I'm all
you.
right.
man.
I'm all right. Yeah, I didn't know if you I've told him about you. I don't know if you recognize
I almost
the
cried.
name because of the sex stuff. Like I wasn't doing. I was looking for you at Adler.
Yeah. No, I haven't been there in a while, and especially since I haven't been there since they moved
They moved
to the new
some
campus.
changes,
Yeah.
Mm.
So I haven't been involved with them for a while, but then this move down to Rochester kind of changed a lot of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah,
Nice.
yeah, it's
And I want to make sure that's not yours, right? I
That
thought
is
I
yours. The
had.
one in the fridge.
Yeah.
That's yours.
Okay. I thought I had one in the fridge, and then this morning I looked, and where I thought it wasn't there. And I'm like, oh shit! I have to go to the store.
Yeah, no.
It's there.
Yeah.
Oh, thank God.
no. You guys have been doing a lot of good work as I look at these
Oh, yeah.
pieces, and
Yeah.
Yeah, I see thinking errors. Do you
Yeah.
guys use thinking reports?
Diary cards or which? What do you mean?
Yeah.
Well, they write down what they did and the thinking error type of deal and what they could do to a better choice for next time.
Sometimes if there's like a significant misstep
Yeah, that's
during treatment, we'll do that. But otherwise, we just have them check in about their week.
I was
And
say
we'll
we
say, what can you
process
think of
that.
from your week where you've used?
We
Did you
actually
prefer
used
five?
them when there
What
was
a
an
great team.
incident and working with trouble teams.
Mm-hmm.
I did that for like 15
Yeah.
years.
and I'm not covering
I see a
Too
lot of your
much.
stuff here.
It reminds you of.
basic primal stuff.
No, that's exactly what we didn't want.
Okay, cool.
We've
what I
had
was-
that year after year after year, and
Okay.
I think in my lifetime I probably done 10 diversity trainings, and
Okay.
no, not the same.
Okay.
Nope, this is great.
Cool.
Wonderful.
It's always difficult to know where your audience is and how to do those things. So.
Assume that we want something different than what you would normally get.
Well, all I have is me. So I'll
Perfect.
keep you.
Then you're perfect. You are perfect.
We've known each other for a long time. When I first got into, so I was working at Anoka County, right? And where were you at the time?
Was that Totino Grace? No.
No, you
Tino
were.
Grace.
That was the
You were at
director.
Oh, were you?
Were you at Totino? Were you?
Or Fairview? Was it Fairview? I think it was at Fairview
Okay.
or Beacon.
Yeah, it may have been Beacon because so that would have been like 2000. No, that would have been before. See, I left there in 10. I started there in 4 or 5, 2004, 2005.
Oh. In Fairview.
But we met at a men's conference. No, it wasn't men's conference. It was a sexual assault or
Oh.
men's gender
Men-
violence.
Peace.
Peace, and yes,
Men-
It all-
Yeah.
it's all. But yeah, it's like my first, one of my first big jobs outside of teaching school. So, did you have the Feltons? I taught at a charter
Oh,
school.
yeah, at Totino Grace had the Falcons.
Yeah, both of them.
I used to go there to compete. Show choir.
Oh, so far,
really?
yeah. I used
Oh,
to travel
sweet.
to go visit.
Yeah, I've worked
Yeah,
in some,
yeah,
but I'm not
I was from
contractually obligated to
Bemidji
do it.
Locomotive.
Can I see your jazz hands?
Oh, I'm the best jazz hand.
So then I don't
Make sure
know
you
if I'm
stretch them all the
technically
way. So
Right.
I don't know how that
Sparkle. We used
So-
to go there every year, though.
That
I
is
thought that was
funny.
like one of the best spots that we went.
So I thought, so with Totino Grace, I think it's really interesting because I wasn't around when it was,
So I think
Bishop,
technically I might have been unemployed.
was
at
it
that time
Archbishop?
while working. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Grace, right?
Grace, yeah.
Yeah, it was just, was it Archbishop Grace or just Bishop Grace?
Bishop Grace.
Bishop Grace. And so when I came around, it was Totino Grace. And when they told me that the Totino Pizza Roll family donated money to have the school named, I was like, what? You can do that? was like, oh, it's on. So right now I'm trying to raise millions of dollars so I can have a school named after me.
Great idea.
There's a building on my college campus named after the Titinos because they donated the money to build it.
Where'd you go
So
to
it's
school?
Titino Hall. Northwestern.
Oh,
in
Northwest.
Roseville.
Yeah. So I was at Bethel. So I taught at Bethel. So, yeah, people think we're conservative until they bump into
Until they go across the
Northwestern.
lake.
Right.
Yeah, no dancing.
Yeah. Long skirts. Long skirts.
Those were the days.
Wow, so many places closed. I'm surprised we still exist.
Well, I kept
Funny.
calling like.
So many
NDSU
other
was,
places closed.
You would have thought that was conservative, but it really was not.
What's that?
NDSU.
Are people
Oh, yeah.
their individual clients today?
My one
Chill.
client
Yeah.
texted me
Farmers.
and was like, I'm not coming.
Oh, he finally did
So-
get back
Yeah, I
to
think
you?
my niece is
So
at
are we still
NDSU.
doing group today?
Go Bison.
I
Yes.
thought there was still group today.
a
I
great
have
college.
one who's
Yeah.
not gonna be there.
Once.
Yeah.
Is that Devontae?
No,
Loved it,
Oh.
loved it.
We have
he's not typically in group.
Oh, okay.
two people still in group, right?
What's that?
Two kids in
Two,
group
how
today?
many, no, how many if we have is still in group?
Mine's coming.
Three.
It's three? Our minimum is three.
Think about last night, Nicola.
Yeah.
And
We had a
then,
good crew.
You only have 3 people.
yes, it lasted till 7 o'clock.
We had a good crew.
Yeah, we stressed it out.
Mm-hmm.
And all I did was check-ins and a presentation of an assignment. We didn't even do anything extra. Chatty Cathy's.
I'm like on the, I wanted to get feedback from you guys because the kid that I would meet with, I really value safety, as do we all.
It's on there as a
It is.
universal value.
Very
Um,
Is this the one that is no longer allowed in group?
Yes,
Okay.
and I'm just like on the fence about whether I should even have him come in because, yeah.
What's the point?
Really?
Is he, well, I mean, wait a minute, though.
But
Based on what Denise said, he's staying then, right?
no,
Oh, he's not staying.
no,
I'm
but
sorry.
but I would want to process him like, not staying.
Like a goodbye.
Yeah, essentially, but
Closing.
like I don't know if that's worth going out in this weather.
Well,
Well, not who.
Yeah,
the one that's
might be.
leaving
My
us
245.
forever.
Oh,
Yes, yeah, because right, like
How many people do you have to pick up?
I don't know. No, they, they're coming and going and.
I would say still, if he can make it, does he have a coat?
I think so, but this is
Well,
just
he's going from home, so.
yeah.
he processed it with the group though.
No, I'm saying not
With you.
because I was planning on
With her.
processing like what's.
Yep.
But I also like
Are they gonna like pull him and put him in residential like
I've
Friday?
I have to talk to Denise because intake is next week, and so I don't want him to be like surprise,
Cause he doesn't know.
I don't know anything.
Oh, he's got to know.
Exactly.
No, I mean, he knows, but you mean like in terms of like he
No.
doesn't know like the time and the place and then
Yes.
when it's physically happening.
Exactly.
Grandma didn't tell us. Huh?
No, she's specifically not telling him.
So he doesn't run.
Yep.
It's fair.
But I
But
just
he's not
don't know-
getting charged, right?
No.
Okay.
But the problem that I have is like, I don't really want kids going out in this weather if they don't have to. I mean, it's frostbite.
In
and-
5 minutes.
It's
full
true.
skin.
Yes, and knowing him, he like wanders around. Like he always ends up wandering
But isn't
around.
he walking from like the door? I mean,
He just walks from the door into the
we're
car.
Talking, we're talking about 30 seconds.
If I mean, but it's him. Like he
Well,
might get lost.
That's a natural consequence for not being. I mean, come on.
I mean,
You can see where you're supposed to be going.
He barely makes it through the.
I think that would actually. I think the weather would keep him in line. He's not going to want to have experience that uncomfort. Natural consequences are sometimes the best ones. I don't mean that he's going to get frostbite, but I just mean like the consequence of it being cold outside and him being goal directed.
lay down
You
and
know
freeze to
what I
death,
mean?
boy, right?
I know why she's the executive director.
I'd be less likely to like wander
wander.
around if it's negative 23 degrees outside. There's my destination. Bam.
Okay.
part.
Okay.
So cool.
Okay.
Thank you for problem solving that in front of me and trusting
Sorry.
that I won't. No, that I won't
Well,
say
we
or
didn't
do
violate
anything,
HIPAA.
so. Right. No.
so-
And I'm not telling. So if you don't scream, I won't holler.
Well, just tell me what you decided to do.
Okay, then I think I'll still meet with them.
Okay.
Is this
All
for
right.
today?
So
I mean,
page 3 in your handout. So all human goals are goal directed, and they're directed towards safety, significance, and belonging. And if you can give people safety, significance, and belonging, you have a friend for life, right? So so there's that. So what I would like to do, actually, let's go back to page 1. So that center circle that we did not address, let's call this the circle of all human knowledge. Okay, it's a little melodramatic, right? Really, a little hyperbolic, right? So no, but let's call this the pie of all human experience, right? So inside of this pie is contained everything. Right on page 1 is contained everything that can be known about the human experience, right? So all science, all math, all history, all languages, all religions, everything that can be known about the human experience is inside of this circle. What I'd like for you to do is to cut out a piece of this pie the size of what you know of everything there is to know. All right? So I want you to cut yourself a piece of pie in that circle on page 1 of everything that you, out of everything that could be known, what do you know about that, right?
Oh, you want to cut, huh?
I was gonna just
If you put
All
the
right.
in the
I
pie.
need to know a little bit.
So right on page 1, that larger circle, just size of what you know. All right. So give me some examples of things that you know.
About?
Yeah. What do you know?
Oh, I know that. Well,
Just one.
You better make that.
I know how to drive.
Okay. You know how to drive. All right. What do you know?
I think I know how to value people.
Okay. You know how to value people. One more thing that somebody knows for sure.
I know how to read.
You know how to read. All right. Cool.
Are you
3
sure?
things that we know. Right. So we have what we know. What I'd like for you to do is to cut a second piece of pie. And this is the size of what you know or you are aware of that you do not know. So there's all the stuff, but you are aware that you don't know certain things. So as an example, I know that I don't know Mandarin Chinese. I know that I should no longer do lobotomies. And I also know that I don't know how to fly an airplane. Right, so those are things that I know that I don't know. So I want you to cut a second piece of pie, which is the size of what you know you do not know. All right. So
Almost the rest of the pie.
oh yeah. What I would say is if you can make that quantifiable, because there's a third piece of pie that we'll also address. So make it quantifiable. It may seem overwhelming, but make it quantifiable so we can address this third piece of pie. All right. So you have what you know, you have what you know you don't know. And so what are some things what are 3 things that people are aware of that they know they don't know? 3 things people are aware of that you know you don't know.
I don't know how to be a therapist.
All right. You don't know how to be a therapist. Okay. Someone else. What's something
I know,
else?
but I do not know how to work QuickBooks.
All right. You know that you don't know how to work QuickBooks. Please raise your hand if you also know you don't know how to work QuickBooks. Okay. Cool. Third.
You know how to work QuickBooks?
Oh, I spaced out.
Wait, I was like, who knows?
Like, who knows? Who knows? All right. What's the third thing? Somebody knows that they don't know.
I know I don't know how to do engineering work.
All right, cool. Raise your hand if you know you don't know how to do engineering work, right? All right, cool. So there are things that we know, there are things that we know we don't know, and what do you think that third piece of pie is?
Things we don't know, we don't know.
Things you don't know, or blind spot. So if you could write the words blind spot in that third piece. So there are things that we know, there are things that we know we don't know, and then we have these blind spots, these things that we don't know, right? As you look at this circle, we may consider this whole circle a paradigm, right? So if you can write that word next to that circle somewhere, paradigm, P-A-R-A.
I was going to say, I don't know how to spell
Yep.
paradigm.
P-A-R-A-D-I-G-M. I used to be hooked on phonics and I used to say paradigm. I was hooked on phonics, and it worked for me. Okay, you missed that joke, but we'll keep going.
That was good.
Thank
Now
you.
I understand how to spell it.
Yes,
Yeah.
good. So paradigm. And what is a paradigm? You've heard people talk about, we need a paradigm shift.
A worldview?
A worldview, right? So a paradigm is a worldview. And when I taught, I would teach my students that is simply the way you see the world. And the way you see the world is important because it will allow you to see or not see certain things, right? So particularly when I heard the conversation earlier about white privilege or white supremacy and that kind of stuff, and I would suggest that those are paradigms, ways of seeing the world or not seeing the world, right? And so we should address those as such, as well as recognize that even in this concept of and I'll talk about why white supremacy is problematic and white privilege is problematic in just a second, because I think there's something more rudimentary that we should address before we even get to those things. But what are those behaviors seeking? Safety.
Security, belonging.
Yep, safety, significance, and belonging.
Significance, belonging.
And what is problematic about those? Is safety, significance, and belonging good things to reach for?
Yes.
Yes, they are good things. However, what becomes problematic?
How we get them.
How we get them, right? And so so as we're working with young people, it is not that they have quote unquote bad, that they're making bad decisions, but how are they getting their safety, significance, and belonging through the decisions that they're making, right? And one of the things I'm working with my nephew on, he is now 18. He has a child out of wedlock. He's trying to find his way, and he keeps saying things that I think are very interesting. And I wonder if I said those same things myself. So I have to ask my mentors at another point. But he keeps saying, "I don't want to make a mistake," and as a 40-something now, I see the world very differently, and I can understand where he's coming from. But what I'm trying to push him towards is less about making mistakes and living with the consequences of your decisions. Can you live with the consequence of your decisions is what I'm asking him. Because we will always make mistakes. But the real question is, do I have the resiliency, the resources to actually learn and advance from the decisions that I make? Right, so that's something that's very important. So our paradigm, how we see the world, is extremely important. We also, again, must recognize that our paradigm is contextual, right? So I don't know that it's fair to fault the past, people in my past, because they grew up in a different context than I did. I can try to understand the context that they were in, the failings that they had in that context, and not make those same mistakes today, right? So that's important. Where white supremacy and white privilege fall short, at least for me, is in its practical application as I've seen it in my own practice, right? So when I was teaching high school, and I would see white kids from Iowa who would come to the Twin Cities, or white kids who lived in Frogtown. I'm not sure if people are familiar with St. Paul and Frogtown, with their hats cocked to the side, with their pants sagging, and with this kind of urban swag kind of thing. What's that?
The swagger.
Yeah, the swagger, the urban kind of swagger thing. It would be easy for me to say that these kids are acting black, right? Or ask, why are they acting black? But if I understand the context, then my question is a moot question, Why would the kids act with this swagger and the hat and the pants sagging? Because they are in a context where those behaviors are accepted, and those are skills that they need in that context. So when people come against young people and say, pull up your pants, or that's dumb, that's stupid, what you're actually saying is your values are dumb and stupid. And how do young people respond to that?
Not well.
Not well. F you! Oh, you! Right? They don't respond well. At least the ones I've interacted with. Maybe the ones you've interacted with respond differently. But what I have been able to do. One thing I have been able to do, or I've been able to find success, is in recognizing what they're after, trying to get them tools that will help them get what they're after, right? So they're looking for safety, significance, and belonging. In your community, where you are, sagging your pants, hat to the side, using certain kinds of language is an advantageous skill to have. However, will you always stay in that context? And so I started teaching my kids within this context. This is great, normal, reliable behavior, but as you move out of that context, you may want to adopt other kinds of behaviors. And never tell kids to change or to not be themselves, but I do suggest to them that they may want to change what their selves looks like according to the context, right? So that they can get the things that they want. And some people, well, I'm not going to sell out. I'm just going to be me. Great, you do that. And let me know how that's working for you, right? As opposed to recognizing that I may have to augment some things in this context or change some things in another context. Not being phony, not being fake. And kids are real sensitive to that, So it is really about being goal driven. So what do you want out of this context, and what do you need to do to get what you want out of that context, right? So paradigm is important. So now we'll go back over to page 3. So what I'd like for you to do is to think about your own life and your own paradigm, kind of growing up. And on a scale of 1 to 5, monocultural meaning that things are very. This is the other thing I was going to say about white supremacy. So white supremacy and privilege, I think, are offshoots. They're not the core. They're not a core emotion, if you will. But at the core of this idea of whiteness, or the issues around whiteness or fragility or whatever people want to talk about, is this idea of white primacy. And I think that is key. And so are people familiar with the concept of primacy? Primacy is this idea that I am primary. Everything, go ahead.
The central.
It's the central. I am the center of everything, and anything outside of this primary or this primal central thing is secondary, right? And fortunately and unfortunately, the Constitution has kind of set that up, and we'll see that as we talk more about some other things around that. So it's white primacy, and if you can help me with language and asking people to really think about that idea that is primary, then we can unravel some of this other stuff. So on page 3, what I'd like for you to do, monocultural meaning one cultural, multicultural meaning multicultural. So in your high school setting, was it a monocultural or a multicultural experience based on a spectrum, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the same with your first job, your current friends, your current neighborhood, your family of origin, and your elementary school. So high school and elementary school. So if you could just do that. So if you could,
So you just want us to circle them?
nope. If you could rate it from 1 to 5. So 1 being monocultural, 5 being actually I have 10 on here. That's interesting.
Yeah.
But rate it from.
Oh.
So instead of 10, put 5. I don't know how that got there. So 1 to 5. So instead of 10,
So a
put
5 would be,
5 would be multicultural,
Yeah.
very multicultural. A 1 would be not very multicultural, being monocultural.
Do you count spouses? of
However
family members?
you want to.
How I define my
Yeah, however
family
you
members.
define family. All right. What I'd like for you to do is to at least pair up with one other person and just kind of talk about how your ratings, and these are your ratings, may have impacted or affected your paradigm, how you've grown up and seen the world. Could those things have an impact on your paradigm? So I'll give about 4 minutes to have those paired conversations. If you can make sure that each of you, if you can make sure that each person at least gets a minute and a half, that'll be great. So 4 minutes starting now. All right. There may need to be a group of
Pair up.
3.
Do we want to be a trio?
We can be a trio.
Sure.
Okay.
Trios?
Yeah, you can do trios. Yeah, so 3 groups. Yeah, that works.
We don't follow directions.
Yeah, no, it's all good.
Mine is
So-
one is for next two.
Yep.
I think I said max
Yeah, that's what I
because
was figuring.
Mine's probably
right, like if we look at culture, it doesn't
Paper
it
route.
means so many
Well, I
different
was
things.
great.
Oh, like you went.
Yeah.
Big Broad.
Current friends.
I mean
Mine's
culture,
about 4 now.
yeah. So
I
many
kind of looked at
Mine's a 2.
race, religion,
Yeah.
I don't know anything about it. I just know.
ethnicity,
I-
kind of stuff.
Well, I'm not
Like,
sure.
feminine